We'll call this meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. First order of business today are the minutes dated January 21st, 2015. I'd ask for a motion. There's a motion to approve. Kovash is our second.
I'll second that.
Second. Any discussion, correction, or addition to those minutes? Being none, all those in favor of the motion to approve signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Recommend approved. We have a first item on our regular agenda, and just for anyone that's here or public, there we had 5 items that were listed on the original agenda, but it's fairly early on. Item 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8, the people decided to withdraw, and we also had one that was a continuum one. So just to be aware that we actually only have a couple items on our regular agenda today. The first item on our regular agenda is a future comprehensive plan amendment. It's to consider amending the Dickinson Comprehensive Plan through adoption of the West Dickinson Choices West Dickinson Area Plan. Adoption of the West Dickinson Area Plan would result in text amendments, amendments to the future land use map, and amendments to the Transportation Master Plan. Now, on this particular item, the city has also been taking public hearing on it, and I think they're going to have one more meeting where there will be public comment.
Steve Josephson, City County Planner. The City Commission has scheduled meeting. It'll be the first City Commission meeting in March to take action. They've already had one reading on it and voted for approval, and at that first meeting, it'll be the second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Josephson. So at this time, I would ask Mr. Josephson and if Mr. Millstone have any comments or recommendations for this at this time.
Steve Josephson, City County Planner. This is the West Dickinson study was undertaken last year, started it late last spring because of concerns about the development in that area that's adjacent to the city, much of which is in the extraterritorial zone. As you recall, there were a number of concerns about what sort of development the city wanted to see in that area and the potential impact of future development on infrastructure and services. The city hired Cattermas, Lee & Jackson to do the study, and as was noted, there were a number of meetings involving the public, and public was given opportunity to comment. There have been 2 combined meetings with the City Commission and the Planning and Zoning Commission, and this is coming back to you for a recommendation to send on to City Commission. Karen Day, who's the consultant from KLJ who's been working on that, is here today, and I'd just like to call her up. She's got a handout for you, and I believe all it is a summary of portions of the plan that you've already seen. So I'd call on Ms. Day to come forward.
Thank you. My name is Karen Day, and I lead KLJ's Community Planning Group. I brought excerpts. I know you all have the complete document and the executive summary, and these are to facilitate discussions this morning, just 4 pages from that, if you wouldn't mind if I...
That'd be just fine.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to note too that there have been no changes that have been made to the plan since the joint meeting, the City Commission and Planning and Zoning.
And that joint meeting was January 20th, so we should all have that document from
That was the
meeting.
most recent. So these are just excerpts from that document. They're exactly as they were in that. And they are just the most important sections, the land use map and then the policies. As Mr. Josephson said, we've had a number of public meetings, and you've had a couple of joint meetings, and we have made adjustments to the plan, and this is the draft as it is now. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have on either the map or on anything that's in there whatsoever. But, you know, we have reviewed it fairly completely in the past meetings.
Any comments or questions for Ms. Day at this time? I have one. We had received a map, I don't know the origin of it, but there had been discussion of an area for proposed residential and some industrial. It was the discussion, a topic of discussion.
Yes.
And there was no formal action taken, no formal recommendation. It was just for a future use. It was a piece of area that was referred to as the Kosteleki property along
Yes.
the railroad tracks to the north side of it. And just to let everybody know that on this map that you just handed out, nothing has changed. And those discussions were primarily for respect of what possibly could happen in the future if this plan was followed and our comprehensive plan was followed, that it was open to discussion, and that was all it was. But it doesn't show up in here, and it shouldn't show up in here. So just to let people know that
So
if
just,
they've heard, there's been no change to anything industrial that was residential.
that's correct. The map, the draft stays as it was. I mean, this is a future land use map, you know, so it's intended to be a guide for the future. It's not in concrete. No zoning change happens, or no change at all happens actually as, you know, as a result of this map. And, you know, as with all future land use maps, it's intended to reflect what the vision of the future is for the community today, and that could change, you know, in the future. So when this map was done and this document was done, it was intended to show what the community thought the 6,100 acres west of Dickinson would be in the future. And then we developed policies that would guide that future, and estimated what costs might be to develop it, the infrastructure that would be needed to support levels of development that are shown on the map. So the purpose of this exercise was to guide the future, not to mandate the future.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we had some verbiage that we were going to put in regarding industrial use near railroad tracks. Did that verbiage get put in the plan? That came out of our last workshop.
It has not been. The map stays as residential that goes all the way to the railroad track. I mean, the parcel that we are discussing is the parcel that's shown south of 10, that's in the bright yellow color. The westerly part of that parcel, west of that creek, is shown as industrial, is West Dickinson Industrial, and the remainder of the parcel is shown as residential.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Josephson or Mr. Millstone, at this time, would you like to add anything else?
Not at this point, but I'll give my recommendation after you've had your public hearing.
All right.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, Commission members. Mark Millstone, Interim Planning Director. I just want to thank the consultant. A lot of man hours and time and effort was put into this, and the city is very pleased with the result. I just wanted to go on record to say that. Thank you.
And I'd reiterate that there was a lot of input, a lot of public hearings, a lot of work by KLJ to get, from the very beginning, to get everybody's input, and everybody that would be a stakeholder or have some interest in this at some point in time, even many years down the road when we're not here. So, thank you. This time, then, I would ask if there's anyone from the public who would like to make comment on this future comprehensive plan. Please feel free to come to the podium, and we'll be glad to listen to your opinions, comments. Being none, is there anyone else on the commission wish to make comment? This time I'd ask Mr. Josephson to give us his recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve Josephson, City County Planning. Planning, you know enough about this plan. It's gone through the process. The staff recommendation is to recommend approval for this, and your recommendation from Planning and Zoning will go forward and be given to the City Commission for their consideration at the next City Commission meeting. And I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Your recommendation will include then the future land use map presented by Ms. Day in there also, right?
Yes, it's everything that's in the document, in the latest document that you've seen, including the future land use map as it's presented to you today.
Thank you. Mr. Millstone, would you like to add anything to that?
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you. This time we'll close the public portion of this hearing, and I would ask for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move that the City of Dickinson Planning and Zoning Commission recommend approval of the West Dickinson Choices West Dickinson Area Plan as consistent with the City of Dickinson Comprehensive Plan, meeting all the requirements of the Dickinson Municipal Code, and also being in the interest of the public health, safety, and welfare.
A motion by Ms. Pierce. Is there a second? Yes. Second by Mr. Ballesteros. Any discussion? Being no discussion, all those in favor of the recommendation to approve, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Thank you for all your work. To the city and county planner, Mr. Millstone. To KLJ, we will pass this on to the city with our recommendation. Item 2 will be item 4, which is a special use permit. To consider a request for a telecommunication tower special use permit for Buell Construction Consulting Incorporated. The site is situated at 11140 34th Street Southwest, and the property is approximately 0.23 acres. At this time, I'd ask the party presenting, please feel free to come forward.
Good morning, everybody. This is Jesse Dybud with Buell Consulting. I represent Verizon Wireless on this tower. This tower is a 119-foot monopole communication tower, again located at 11140 34th Street Southwest in Dickinson. It's currently zone agricultural and is currently undeveloped. I'll open it up for questions and comments.
Any questions at this time, Mr. Beal?
Mr. Chairman, the one question I have is have you had a chance to see the revised conditions?
I have had a chance to see the revised conditions, and if you do choose to impose the newest condition, we'll take that into consideration when we do go to construction, if that's possible.
Thank you.
Was that a yes, Mr. Josephson? Did you agree to his comment?
The condition is the condition, and they will need to follow that.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This time I'd ask if there's anyone in the public who'd like to make comment on this special use permit. Please feel free to come forward. Mr. Heiser.
Morning, Chair and board members. I see in Steve's condition there, the only concern is approach going in there. And the way I read it is if the streets are replatted, you'd have to come off one of them streets. So my concern is where the approach goes into that property with the rolling train there, that would be, accessibility be the only problem that I can see.
I'd like to hear a comment from Mr. Kubis, engineer at this time on that.
Mr. Chairman, I think the intent of the condition, it's now condition number 6, is that, just what Mr. Heiser was saying, at some point in time in the future, 40th Street will more than likely be regraded, or County Road 34th Street would be regraded. It is rolling, right now, it's in a good location, it's kind of top of the hill, but if it would be regraded, that approach might be steep, and I think that was the intent of the condition, to always provide, we'll be bound to provide access to this site, and we want to provide the best access that's possible. It might not be directly off of 40th Street in the future, so I think for right now, the train is rolling, but it's in a good location today. In the future, coming off some platted avenue might be a better location for their access point, so.
Thank
Mr. Chairman, just to explain that, if you remember the last meeting, there was a fair amount of discussion about the access point and what would happen if that property was ever platted, and would there be potential conflicts. And the applicant was sent back, and so were staff, with the direction of craft a condition that would address access should the property ever be platted. And that's the condition number 6. And planning and engineering worked on that and came up with the condition of, if the property the tower is located on is ever platted, access to the property shall be taken exclusively from a platted street within the subdivision, and the previous access shall be abandoned.
So that's pretty wide open as
It-
far as how the access would be put in.
I would say so, keeping in mind when they plat the property, they're going to need to take, that's one of the things we're going to look at is, how is that tower location going to be accessed through the subdivision itself? That's a consideration that'll happen during the planning process.
And the incurrence of a liability as far as the expense of that, who's going to pick up the tab for that if we really recommend that?
I guess our policy right now is it would be an interior street that whoever was platting that property would be responsible to build that street. I think the maintenance or the access to this site off of whatever street might be platted, it might be nothing more than an approach. It might be a platted street going directly adjacent to the site. But any interior street, whether it's a private access or a dedicated street, is the responsibility of the developer. So.
All right.
Yes, and the concern that was expressed last time was, you may have an existing approach that's granted for the tower, but sometime in the future, if the property's platted, you may have an approach in one location and then an access point to the subdivision that could conflict. That was the primary issue I was getting out of it, was if the subdivision is ever platted with an access onto the road and they've already got an access, does it make sense to have two access points that could potentially cause conflicts? Although the tower itself does not generate a lot of traffic.
Right.
But we took the point of the Planning and Zoning Commission and crafted this condition, which we believe should address this issue.
Right. Thank you.
That should answer my question. Like, only concern is right on top of the hill is the best place for the approach now, and if it stays there and then if streets are replatted, then they'll just come off somewhere else. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Heiser. Any other comments? If there's anyone else in public who'd like to make comment, please feel free to come forward. Anyone else from the commission wish to make comment? This time I'd ask for a recommendation from Mr. Josephson.
Steve Josephson, City County Planner. The recommendation for the special use permit is the same as last month, which is approval subject to conditions. At the direction of Planning and Zoning Commission, we added that condition number 6 to address the access issue, that should the property ever be platted. And we have no idea when this is going to be platted. There's nothing that's come before us, that's come before staff for review and recommendation. But it just states that should it be platted sometime in the future, it will take access off of a platted road. And as staff reviews the plat, that will be a consideration of how is the internal road system going to provide access to that piece of property? And I believe that would address Mr. Heiser's concerns. And I'm here to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions on the recommendation? This time we'll close public portion of this hearing, and I'd ask for a motion.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Frederick?
I move the City of Dickinson Planning and Zoning Commission recommend approval of the petition for special use permit for a 119-foot monopole telecommunications tower, subject to the conditions listed above, as meeting all the requirements of the Dickinson Municipal Code and also being in the interest of public health, safety, and welfare.
Is there a second to that motion? A second by Ms. Meyer. Any further discussion? If being none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carried. Recommend approval. Thank you very much. Item 5, which is item 3 today on our regular agenda, is a rezone. To consider a rezoning petition from agricultural to low-density residential, medium-density residential and community commercial, general commercial, and public. The site is generally located in the north half of Section 6, Township 139 North, Range 96 West. The site is approximately 282 acres. This time I'd ask the party presenting, please feel free to come forward.
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioners. Sean Sorn with Boundary Engineering, here representing the Barron's Group on this Barron's Vista project. With me today, I also have Steve Circle, John Novak, and Kathy Cronin, who are also part of the team working on this project. As you're aware, this project's been in the works for quite some time, and I believe it was last June we started with a urban service boundary amendment to include the property within the City of Dickinson's urban service boundary, and then came in with the rezoning request, which did include a planned unit development for the property, trying to get smaller lots. Since that time, we withdrew in that application and are coming back with just a straight rezoning request, which does include just single-family housing, some R2 lots, general commercial, community commercial, and some public and open space. With the layout that we've got in the map that you have in front of you, I believe was part of your packet. We started working on a preliminary plat to go along with the rezoning to kind of give an idea of how we're seeing some street layouts. In no way are they finalized, but the streets are just kind of a start to the preliminary platting process that we're working on. With this rezoning request, we do have approximately 80 acres of single-family housing, which is mostly along the west side and the south borders of this property, which does abut the agricultural areas adjacent to us. And then we've got, I can't read my notes here, but approximately 28 acres of the general commercial, which is the area on the north side of the property that abuts the interstate, which matches what Roars has done across the interstate on that side. 28 acres, almost 29 acres of public open space, which does include a trail system that goes all the way through the residential development from the west side all the way to the east. And then it looks like about 69 acres of community commercial on the east portion of the property. That portion, of course, is abutted on the east by a planned unit development, the Dickinson Hills, which is mostly a development made up of commercial components to it, and we're looking to tie into that development as well. So with that, we do have John Novak, who is the architect working on it. He does have a PowerPoint that he'd like to share with you. I think we'd like to bring him up now and let him do that.
He's just fine, thank you.
Hi, John Novak with Hirschman Architects. PowerPoint will start. I'm the lead design, director of design at Hirschman Architects, the lead designer on the project. We're handing out some of the PowerPoint that you're going to see. It's a kind of a visualization, a kind of an elaboration on the plat plan that you see. I don't know if it's up. Perfect. One.
Thank you.
So the document you're getting is a printout of what I'll be sharing on the PowerPoint. So yeah, as I was brought on, I think my role has been to kind of visualize the future development as sort of elaborate on the civil structure that's been put in place in the drawings. And I sort of saw it or took it upon ourselves to kind of think of it as an experiment, kind of a thought experiment for your benefit, for our benefit, to sort of run an experiment, a kind of a legitimate experiment on what we think the future full build out of the property would look like. And as kind of an experiment, I think there are some conclusions that we drew. One of the conclusions, and probably pertinent to our conversation today, is regarding the relationship of phasing versus zoning. I think a project of this size, we will be looking at it in terms of 2 phases, potentially more as the market demands it. And I think when you're dealing with 280 acres, it's quite a large bite to sort of take off. But the relationship of the planning and zoning relative to phasing, I think that what we kind of concluded was that we need a holistic zoning approach in order to holistically tie the whole site together. Right now, the phasing line, just on this little drawing, it sort of runs down in the north-south direction, bisecting the site into 2 pieces, but in fact, the layout of the site runs east-west, and the grain of the site runs east-west. And there's a lot of good reasons for that in terms of our address to I-94, creating buffers from the residential to I-94, making relationships to some of the other commercial developments. So there's a strong east-west axis to the site that needs a kind of a whole all-in zoning approach to the whole 280 acres, as opposed to some of the conversation that's going on right now is about zoning the first phase and then zoning the second phase. And I think that may restrict our ability to develop the property properly in the future. The second page in your package, this is sort of that scenario planning, that sort of imagination of kind of peering into the future. What we did, I think we made some legitimate assumptions about the sort of beachfront property along I-94 and the relationship of the commercial space, which essentially wraps, well, and let's looking from kind of clockwise, I'll take you through clockwise, but essentially there's this kind of wrapper of commercial space around the perimeter. It's starting with some assumptions, and again, this is just one of an infinite number of scenarios, but one that we think is a legitimate expression of what site development could be. Maybe it starts with an idea of a gas station, some kind of large home goods store, car dealership, some things that are appropriate for address along the interstate that becomes really the front door into Dickinson. Moving clockwise around the plan, this parcel in the northeast corner is particularly important. It's something that I think the developers committed to providing a gateway piece into the city on the west approach into the city. And in this particular expression of it, the conversation is revolved around the idea of it being a 200,000 square foot mall, year-round winter garden, and a sort of year-round amenity for the people of Dickinson to enjoy. It becomes a kind of landmark or signature piece. And I'll elaborate on that later. in the presentation. I've got some sort of visualization of that signature piece, which I think the developer is excited to sort of propose as something for the community. However, in our conversations, we also recognize that there could be other expressions on this corner of something signature, whether it's a lifestyle center, an outdoor walking mall, a town center. I've got my eye on this corner, this quadrant, as having a lot of potential as a sort of public amenity, as well as a commercially viable sort of development. And then sort of kind of completing the thought of retail as it wraps around to the kind of southeast and makes its connections to the existing developments that are currently going on there around the site. So I think the idea of a kind of outer perimeter of commercial retail is a smart use of that land. This gives you a pretty good representation of the figure ground, the amount of solid surface that's going to be covered. We used the multiplier of 4 cars per 1,000 square foot. So as we were looking at 50,000 square foot big boxes or 20,000 square foot smaller retail, this gives you a sense of what the lot coverages would look like. It's a pretty accurate representation of the amount of coverage we would need. Moving inboard a little, this is the kind of one of the kind of cores to the project. There's a proposal for some potentially some small office, 4-story Class A, could be something that's a useful contribution to the community. Preserving existing land features like the Butte, that becomes a kind of central park. And essentially the commercial wraps around the Butte, so the Butte remains as a sort of iconic element. And then the remaining acreage for the residential. And I think that's what we're talking about in terms of that north-south sort of boundary that would divide phase 1 from phase 2 is really not, I mean, that's an economic choice, not a zoning choice. Our thinking is holistic. And so part of what I'm going to show you in sort of the coming slides, some aerial perspectives and some sort of zooming around from the sky. What I'd like to show is that I think that we need a kind of clarity on the zoning that's holistic to the whole 280 acres, so that allows us to sort of with confidence grain the site in this direction, the east-west direction, without really being hindered by the necessity of having phasing. So the third page is the aerial perspective. This is looking northeast, sort of over the adjacent property. And again, I think when it's fully built out, ideally you wouldn't recognize that there's any kind of phasing in here because we're master planning it up front and we're seeing it as a holistic development. But here again, from the air, you can see the kind of texture that's starting to be created in terms of the perimeter, commercial retail, and then the interior sort of softer space of the development. I think, again, this is not an unrealistic representation of the landscape. I know what's there right now isn't much in terms of green, like trees and whatnot, but this is give you a pretty, I usually associated 1 to 2 trees per house, so an allotment of that. So sort of a commitment to upgrading the vegetation, whatnot. I think that really helps to soften the harshness of the development. This is a kind of reverse view, and I'm sort of speaking for the developer in a sense with this perspective, but having talked it through with them, they really do have this vision of this winter garden. So for your benefit, for ours, for the developers as well, this represents approximately 200,000 square foot indoor mall with a covered year-round botanical garden, essentially, that the vision that the client has sort of imposed to me or given to me is this idea of, like, in the middle of the winter, this is still a place to go and bring your kids. And I've got 2 2-year-olds. I know my wife's always struggling with where to bring the kids indoors to play in the winter. So I could see this as a sort of an amenity for people with small children that can run around. And I think that's what they're trying to promote. And so this is a view looking to the southwest, and then we can see the sort of boundary of the north boundary with I-94 just off camera here, with this retail development, commercial development, and then we handle the knuckle signature piece, and then we go towards the south. And off in the distance is the residential development. The Butte is right here. Looks bigger in real life and models smaller for some reason, but these are 5-story Class A office spaces, so it's probably a fairly accurate representation of the Butte itself, and I think it is important that we preserve existing landform. You know, in this day and age, when you model something, you can just look at it from 100 different views. So this was just another view, looking at that northeast quadrant, with the way that I'm sort of imagining through the conversations that we had, the way that the freeway addresses the potential mall space with the botanical gardens covered space on the corner here, making some kind of relationship back to the freeway. So I think it becomes an icon, really right at the gateway into the city, the western gateway. So I think it's a very intelligent use of that northern quadrant in terms of urban design. And then the final was just through, again, conversations, just a kind of visualization of what I think, you know, I'm hearing the developer wants to bring to the table as well in terms of the interior space and the idea of this sort of lush garden, this year-round garden in this sort of free span space. So there's more to the project than just, you know, platting 280 acres. I think there is a kind of commitment to producing urban space and amenities for Dickinson. So that's kind of where we're at in our conversation, and I think sort of underscoring for you the idea that what we're looking for in terms of the zoning is a kind of single use zoning, single sort of phase zoning, and then allow us the opportunity, you know, from economic point of view, to phase the project as we need it, but to have the assurance moving forward that we have a sort of an all-in, all-encompassing zoning concept. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nowak.
Good morning. Steve Circle. We're going to come up and wrap up a little bit here and kind of come around full circle on this presentation. As representing the Barron's Group, we've read through our new staff report, and I'm sure you have as well, and want to cover a couple of points. We don't necessarily disagree with any of it. We think hopefully we're there to something that works. For the last several months, as Sean has mentioned, we've been working on addressing comments, and I think this process is a good process because it gets that feel of what you just saw here is what the community wants, what you want, as well as what we want. I would recommend item number 2, as Mr. Josephson has recommended for a possible motion for approval with a slight modification, which would be is that I'd like to add in that, one, we get zoning and holistically like we were talking about. And then 2, maybe a recommendation for staff to begin a development agreement, because a lot of the conditions and a lot of the issues that was stated in the staff report and the analysis really needs to go into a development agreement. That's the next step in the process. So as we're here just asking for putting the color on the map of our property holdings, when we come forth with a preliminary plat, that's where a lot of those issues really need to be ironed out, and we're willing to do that. So whether we begin that process or we work with staff, I think it comes with a recommendation from you to do that. So having said that, stand for any questions you may have. Hope you like everything you've seen. I think we've given you more than you probably need, but with the size of this project, I think it's worth it. And I hope it helps you guys with understanding what we want to do with the property.
Thank you, Mr. Circle.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd ask, anyone have any questions or comments on what we've heard so far?
Mr. Chairman, I have a few questions for
Oh,
the
go ahead.
applicant. I actually have a question for Mr. Josephson and Mr. Kubis first. Your recommendation about Phase 1 and Phase 2, based on the city's ability to provide infrastructure, was that mostly just based on the fact that they had drawn that line for Phase 1 and Phase 2, or does the city have a certain boundary where it would be difficult to provide infrastructure?
Steve Josephson, City County Planner, did talk to staff about this to see which part of this has either available services or assurance of services at this time. And there have been improvements being done to water and sewer that would be able to serve the portion that the applicant had indicated as Phase 1. There's also a platted street through an adjacent subdivision that would be able to serve it. Phase 2 at this point is going to be dependent upon the construction of a lift station and a sewer line, which there's been some discussion with the applicant that they said that they would build it. That's not in writing yet. And then the second thing is the issue. It goes back to the previous issue of a platted street, or just even enough right of way to construct a road to serve a residential neighborhood. And that's been the sticking point on that second phase is that there isn't enough right of way to build a road to city standards. I believe that's a collector over there. So looking at it, saw for a number of reasons, not just the fact that there was infrastructure was assured for Phase 1, but also it's primarily a commercial development and seems to be consistent with the development to the east of it.
But so their line, say it was drawn differently, it wouldn't make much of a difference, say it was straight instead of curved. It's just the fact that there's that many more units that would need city services.
It wouldn't make that much difference.
Okay.
My understanding is it wouldn't make that much more difference. The concern is about the western portion of it.
Okay. And then my question related to that for the applicant, I'm looking on the parcel map, Parcel 1 and Parcel 2, and noting that it doesn't look like the phase line matches up with the parcel line, and it looks like it probably spills over into Parcel 2, and who owns that land now, and would there be any issue if there were approval just of Phase 1? Would that line be redrawn? What was the thinking behind what portion of the plan is Phase 1 versus Phase 2?
Great question. Really, let's talk about the phase line. The phase line was really generated hearing you guys over the last several months about you want to see some residential. We want to bring some residential as well. And so the phase line is preliminary. It is flexible. And the attorney representative of the seller of the property is here tonight, or here this morning. And I think we can adjust that as needed. We're not too worried about that, and that's really the next step for the design is to do that. So we don't envision any issues as far as if we got to move that line around, buy more property, whatever, we're willing to do that. And I believe we even have a takedown schedule for this year to take the second parcel down as well.
And then I had another question as far as the section of fairway that goes through Diamond Hills. Suppose that is not built by the owner of that parcel. What is this group's plan as far as whether to build,
Yeah, I was speaking with Mr. Josephson and also Mark Millstone last night about it, and those are great things, and that's why I think moving in a development agreement makes sense. That's our next step. Speaking in particular for that road, if it's not built, if we want to develop ours, we fully envision that being that now it's public right-of-way, we will have to design and build that. So with that said, we would be asking you, in that time when we come forth with that proposal in front of you is, can we have any kind of latecomers agreement or something like that to maybe recoup some of those investments we got to do to provide access to us from any other developer in the middle between the missing link, that kind of thing. So you probably have dealt with that before in the past, and it's a logical request that we would hope. And
then last question, what is the status of discussions with the surrounding landowners as far as, that 50th Street right of way?
Yep. Great. We met with the property owner, Jody Arthot, after the last time we met here. We had Mr. Kubis with us. We presented what we want to do, and with respect, they didn't come to the table, and they're not interested in giving any right-of-way up front now. We are certainly willing to give what we can with what we have under contract to purchase. When you're dealing with existing 66 feet of right-of-way and you need more for your ultimate future plan, we understand that. But at this time, whether it's phase one and then a portion of phase two, can we get by with 66 feet of right-of-way? Can we put in a road? And being an engineer, I know we can put a road in that space in order to, may not be the ultimate capacity you need, but a 40-foot road gets a lot of trips on it. And at that point in time, maybe sometime in the future, who knows what property owners to the west and the south of us are going to do. But at that time, when they come forth like we are, then I think the city has ability to be able to acquire that right away. But we attempted to try to get it up front, and they weren't interested in doing that. And one of the main reasons why, and I think one of them's here to talk as well, but is they were asking us, what are we going to build? Well, if you look at the zoning as described by Sean and shown by Jonathan, is we're at the R1, lowest density we can do along that corridor on a residential standpoint to try to buffer between the commercial and their property being agriculture. So I think we've been responsible in laying out our plat that way to try to minimize that impact to them. But at this point in time, I can't assure you that we can get more than 66 feet, which is what you currently have, with the exception of what we can give you within our strip of ownership.
Thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any comments or questions at this time? This time I'd ask if there's anyone in the public to would like to make comment. In the comment, please restrict your comments. I don't want to inhibit anybody from coming up and speaking up, but this is specifically for a rezone. Anything else you've heard is purely speculative. So this is about a rezone for the use of this property. If anyone would like to make comment, please feel free to come forward. Anyone else from the commission wish to make comment? I'll make a comment. I support the rezone, and specifically the way it's drawn out, the rezone of this property. The rezone does not change anything as far as what you've heard about what could be there, because we've seen it before, and it also leads to the potential of people coming back and asking for some of that property to be rezoned again, because right now all their plans are speculative. There's a lot of work in the future for this property to be used according to the rezone request, if they so choose to and get down the road that far. But this does not imply in any way that this is going to give them any right-of-ways, road rights, their neighbors, what their neighbors decide to do. This is strictly for the internal use of this property. So we ought to keep that in mind. And I support that. I think, this property could be developed this way. That'd be great. Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'm
Jax.
I'm going to vote no on the rezoning. We've been looking at this project for I don't know how many months now, and we've talked about access, we've talked about lot sizes, land use in different locations, a lot of other detailed things, but I don't think we've ever really faced the question, the one that's always been on my mind, as to whether or not we need the project for the proper growth of our community. We have an awful lot of commercial ground that's undeveloped right now in Dickinson, at a number of locations in Dickinson, most of it in West Dickinson. We've got residential ground that, if fully developed, is going to accommodate far more people than we have today. I think we have to ask ourselves, does there come a point that we say no to any project because we already have enough? That's a really tough question, because we know that some of that ground that's already platted and rezoned in Dickinson is probably not going to be developed. And that causes a problem for us. It causes a problem for this board, causes a problem for us as a city. But we have to make the judgment call. There may be a time coming that this project is right at a different time. I have no problem with the layout. I don't think I have any problem with the suggested land use. You know, there may be some tweaking of the plat, of the rezoning request or whatever. I'm not saying that. But generally, I have no problem with it. I also think that all the detail things we've been talking about lately can be solved. If we as a city say we need this subdivision, then I think we have to partner with the developer to solve the difficulties, to solve the problems that are inherent with the plat. But I don't feel that way right now. I don't think we need this subdivision. The time may come that we do, but I don't think it's now. So I'm going to be voting no.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson, I have a question. Do you, if this ever came to fruition, this one, is there any cost estimates? What it would cost the city to our portion of getting infrastructure, the expense of this project going through as proposed? At what point in time would that be ever come on a capital expenditure?
You know,
schedule?
others probably can answer that better than I can, but let me say this. The guts of our infrastructure, if you will, by this summer are going to, by and large, be taken care of. Whether it's for this tract of land, areas to the north, whatever it may be. Now, there will still be significant infrastructure that has to be built for this subdivision, most of which the developer will be paying for. But the core of our system is going to be pretty well taken care of. We had to discourage and even delay a lot of requests last year because we didn't have the infrastructure. We won't have to do that for the most part in 2015. So Mr. Kubis and maybe others can add to that.
Mr. Chairman, several months ago when this board was brought forth with the request to extend the urban service area, we had our consultants look at water and sewer, which is typical, kind of standard practice now for all our developments. And like Commissioner Jackson said, we posed that analysis, or we framed it in the context that those big picture, the backbone of our network would be built, which is almost true. There's a water project that's to be completed. The sewer trunk lines are completed now. There's really one outstanding utility project, CIP project that needs to be built that would service this. And we looked at a couple different options from the sewer standpoint. One was a lift station that would serve this development and pump it to the west over to the business loop. That's a possibility. I think if that were the project to be built, that would be a developer-funded project as it serves their development. A CIP project we have on our list tentatively in 2017 is a gravity main that would serve this property, a portion of this property, the residential mostly, and many acres north of the interstate. It would all drain and flow down towards Highway 10, and then all that infrastructure is in place now to take that all the way to the water treatment plant, or the wastewater treatment plant. So that would be one component. Going off of memory, I think that was an $8.5 million estimated cost for that sewer project. But again, right now that's not under design. It's out a couple years at least in our CIP project. Probably serves mostly what was discussed as phase 2 of this project. And then the road network, again, typically funded by developers. I think, we've had discussions about building a collector road versus building something more on the lines of a local street on 50th has been the discussion on the west border of this property to connect with Highway 10 as the second access point. Those discussions, again, have been preliminary, but no discussion of who would bear the cost. I think, let me back up, I think the developer has verbally suggested that they might be willing to build that local street. So there's some infrastructure to be built. The water, through the development agreement with Dickinson Hills, would be extended into the property along Fairway Street. We've ran through several different options with water. There would be some off-site costs with that as well to bring another line in, but I think those costs would be fairly minor in the scope of a 300-acre development.
Thank you, Mr. Kubas.
Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Mr. Al?
Craig, in the event that Dickinson Hills does not go through, Ron Radden does not go through with this project, who becomes responsible for the build-out of Fairway Street across that project to access this project? Will it be the city's cost for that?
Well,
It is a public street.
It's public right away right now. There's no street right now. It's a great question. I don't know if I'm the person to necessarily answer that. Right now, the only contractual agreement that exists anywhere to build that street is the development agreement with Dickinson Hills that says you need to build Fairway Street. The when of that isn't spelled out in that development agreement. Assuming that when you want to build, to obtain a building permit, you need to build Fairway Street. When that happens, like I said, isn't spelled out. The city could sure undertake that project if we would want, but right now, when Dickinson Hills was being platted and the development agreement being formulated, Barron's Vista wasn't out there. We were looking at it as a major access point, planned to serve areas to the west, but at the time it was only to serve Dickinson Hills, so that responsibility is theirs right now, is Dickinson Hills. Correct.
And worst case scenario, I guess I have to agree with Commissioner Jackson in this. Right now, I think we're putting the cart out in front of the horse. Even in a rezone, I mean, we're granting an entitlement that allows them to basically do whatever they want to do with that property, whether they flip it or build it. And in a lot of cases, we've seen a lot of developers decide that they would rather flip than build. We have a lot of acres out there, and I think it's irresponsible of us as a board to grant another 200 and some acres worth of zoning when we are in a major slowdown that's taking place in energy, and knowing that a lot of these projects may not move forward. I believe we need to allow for infill on projects that are already in existence or we've already granted the entitlement. But my concern is to the city, say that Ron Radden does not go through with his project, and he's going to put the brakes on that project. I visited with him. Fairway Street is right now his responsibility. These guys want to move forward with their project. Whose responsibility is it then? It's their responsibility then. Put Fairway in, right? Or is it the city's?
Well, again, I think I don't get to make that decision, but we have made a decision that the city was not going to build Fairway Street, that it was going to be funded by development. I think what Mr. Circle was referring to was a latecomers agreement that if they were to build that street, they'd like some mechanism to recoup some costs from the initial party who was required to build it, being Dickinson Hills. I don't know that we've done that, Mr. Colling, but I think it's not outside the realm of possibilities.
Mr. President, Commissioners, we have done something similar to that with other developments. We do have some areas where we sort of leapfrog over undeveloped areas, and a developer has to construct infrastructure through what is currently an undeveloped area. I think if this development would go forward today, if we started into a development agreement with this developer, my expectation would be that they would have to develop Fairway Avenue, or Fairway Street rather, and then have some sort of mechanism to recoup costs if Dickinson Hills did develop. Because I do think, along with you, that Dickinson Hills is going to be a delayed project, and that road is not going to get constructed this year. So if this development goes forward, we'd have to have a mechanism to get that road network and water and sewer infrastructure connected to this area.
You have that mechanism. It's called taxing those that exist here today, right?
Well, you know, if Fairway Street had to be developed without Dickinson Hills participation, I think it would be the Barron's Vista Group that would bear the cost of developing that road. We don't have it in our capital improvement plan to develop Fairway Avenue or Fairway Street, and I can't see the city expending money to do that at this point since it's not on our plan. It would be something we'd have to have a mechanism in the development agreement for Barron's Vista to be repaid in the event that Dickinson Hills subsequently developed.
Thank you, Mr. Cooling. Any other comments? Yes, you can come forward, please.
My only input is, I know you just did the West Dickinson Comprehensive Plan. I think our plan matches that. I think putting color on the paper, you guys have been able to do that. We have not been able to do that. This property, just to remind you, is the last furthest west property within our school district that we can build. Housing is still an issue. There is an oil turn down. We don't know what these other developers are going to do, whether they're going to go forward. But right now, we have someone wanting to build these houses out for sale. Right now, they are coming to the table with money. You question whether they're going to do it. We've waited a long time for color on that map so we can go forward with our plat. And we talk to Barron's continually, and they're saying, what's happening? Why can't we get along with our preliminary plat? So what the other developers are going to do with the land that you have rezoned, I don't know. You know, it's a downturn. It might not be. Our guys are ready to go forward. They're ready to build those houses. We still have a need for more affordable housing. And yeah, I think that the development, which developer is going to go forward with their color on the map, we don't know. That's an economic thing. These guys have looked at it very hard, and they've decided that we are going forward with our project. I don't know what the other guys are doing. Dickinson Hills for one, and that's a hurdle that they will overcome. I mean, if they have to build the road, they'll build the road. But I would hate to see this group go away for what they're promising to bring to the city of Dickinson as far as new mall, the infrastructure, the housing. I'd hate to see it go away. Right now, they're at the table. And there is a downturn in the oil. We don't know what everyone else is going to do. So I would like to ask that you pass at least the zoning part of it so we can go on to our platting part and see what we can come up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you state your name for the record, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
Apologize, I'm Catherine Cronin. I represent Barron's and the real estate end of it.
Mr. Elkin would like to ask a
Kathy,
question.
I'd like to ask you, has this group ever thought of working in conjunction with another developer? I mean, and I'm talking about Dickinson Hills, on that commercial property. I mean, that's a worthy project.
Absolutely, Jay.
And
Yep.
have you visited with Radden about that?
Absolutely. I've called Jay or Ron many times. I end up being referred back to his agent. He does not seem to want to come to the table and sit down. And I understand. He doesn't want the competition for the commercial retail space. I understand that. But like I told his agent, we have every benefit to work together on that because the things that are going to go on his corner are not going to go on our land. He has some highway stuff that should go there. He had a great plan, and yes, I was proposing that we kind of work together on some of that, because I don't see them as a threat at all.
Well, and he's told me the same thing, that Mr. Corcoran and this group and he have met, but just couldn't resolve their differences or whatever's taking place.
Well, we've not been able to have any discussions with him. And, you know, we even tried to do the access towards the north part because I thought it would be nice to put an access between their hotels on the north end and the mall. It would just benefit everybody, and that gives us our access. That was the #1 thing we went after. And Ron didn't want to come to the table on that, so that was one of the things we couldn't resolve. So we kind of went ahead with ourselves, and it's a great expense for us to go out to 50th Avenue and develop that, but our developers right now are willing to do that. That is a tremendous trust and faith that this project is going to go forward, that they would put all that money in out there. We'd much rather come through Ron Radin's.
Have you attempted to work with any of the other groups that already have the entitlement of you know, whether it be commercial or
Sure.
industrial? I mean, we've got the Meyer Group. They have a huge holding of land. You've attempted to work with those groups as well?
Not with Meyer. We did have offers on different chunks of land around town.
Okay.
But for one reason or another, the owners didn't care to go forward. And Ed was familiar with all of those attempts that we tried to place at different places. But what about that corner for Dickinson? I mean, this project could be a beautiful project at the entrance of our community. And to say no to that just because someone up north or someone else has some other color land, I think is an injustice. And I would just like to see you pass it. Any other questions?
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
This time, if there's anyone else who'd like to make comment, please feel free to come forward, and we'll glad to hear you. And I tried to make a comment earlier about that this is strictly on a rezone. There's no implication of any, and I've heard that some people feel there is, and maybe there is, that we owe something to the developer if we rezone this. But there's an implication that we're going to get right-of-ways, pay for roads, or maybe partnership with paying for roads down the road. But I see it where, no, it's not. But if it is, I'd like to hear, Mr. Colling, is there any implication whatsoever of, well, we've heard a lot of things that have nothing to do with this rezone. The problems have existed prior to this rezone request of access already, of infrastructure, of water, sewer, all of those things. Is there any implication or we've made any commitment to anyone for doing anything further if this rezone would take place or not?
Mr. Chairman, I think if the rezone does pass today, we'll take that as staff as direction to work with the developer and begin crafting a development agreement. They do have a preliminary plat application, which I think has been submitted or will be submitted soon if it hasn't. So we'll take that as staff as direction to go forward with that process and bring you a development agreement and a plat that we think is going to work for the city and for the developer. As far as implications on additional expenditure of city funds to construct infrastructure, there is nothing that the rezone itself would commit the city to on that. That's something that we would work through in a development agreement and see what sort of infrastructure was necessary, whether that's roads or lift stations or anything else. You know, we'd have to work that through a different process if this rezoning goes forward. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does, and also the fact that under a development agreement, the issue of expenses and who is going to pick up the tab for roads, infrastructure, that could be done before the rezone took place also, couldn't it? Those agreements.
they could. Typically, we don't like to do that because it does take a lot of time to put a development agreement together and to negotiate out those terms. And unless there's an indication from this commission that you're open to the rezoning, I would prefer not to put the time into a development agreement that where land is not going to be rezoned to fit the project. So I think it's really the zoning decision that would be our direction as staff to begin putting together a development agreement and a plat.
Thank you, Mr. Colon.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Jackson.
you know, I would maybe say that in a little different way. We've been looking at this project for a long time, and I just think it deserves up or down on the project.
Mm-hmm.
For these folks, for our time, staff's time, everything else. If we approve zoning today, the rezoning, to me, that is an indication that we like the project as a board and that we want to see the project go forward, even though formally we still have to approve the subdivision plat. I don't know why we would approve the rezoning if we're not intending to approve the plat and the rest of it. I just think it's time to be up or down on the project.
And I agree with you, and I believe this is a good fit for this property. But from what I've heard, I would not want to imply that anything is being given consideration or this be moved up on any type of priority list or time commitment from staff, that there's no reason, I don't believe, that the people who propose this project, they could go out and get contracts that they could bring in and say, look, we have a contract. We will build this road. We have a contract with our neighbors to get access. That could be done prior to rezoning also. I think, and they could do the legwork. Our staff wouldn't have to do the legwork. The city wouldn't have to incur an expense on this. They could come to us with a legitimate contracts of access and all the other issues that have been holding it up. And they could do all the legwork. They could bring in the contracts, and then we could rezone this very quickly. And based on those contracts being agreed upon by all the parties that this developer wants to work with to gain their access. But the rezone itself, if it implies anything, I too cannot see putting the cart, ahead of the horse on this. When there's legal contracts that have to be resolved by the parties with other private parties, not with the city. And then if we go ahead and incur time and expense on the city for something that's not going to happen for several years down the road, we're already into those situations. So I think it would be a good project, but they've got to do some more work themselves. Mr. Friedrich.
Just a couple comments. We've looked at it this many times, and I think everybody knows what my feeling is. I mean, I believe what they've presented is enough for us to grant them rezoning. The access rights, I think they have enough access for the first phase as of right now. I don't like us saying to a developer that's potentially going to build this out that we don't think we want your project because we have approved all these other projects that aren't getting built. I have a real hard time with that. I don't think approving zoning and making a requirement that they sit down with Mr. Coling and work out a development agreement before platting would do any hurt or harm in any way. And can we put a sunset clause on the zoning? I mean, if it's not developed in 24 months, or we haven't approved the plat in 24 months, the zoning would revert back?
You always have the ability to change zoning as a board based upon what you feel is the highest and best use of the property. So you can do that at any time.
We have acres of land all over the city that have been zoned, platted for years that nobody's doing anything with. And by telling these guys no, it makes that property all of a sudden worth a lot more money because these people can just sit on it. We're not going to bring any more land into the city and approve anything because we've already approved enough. What if they never develop it? Everybody knows we have a shortage of R1 lots in this town. We have a lot of approved R1 subdivisions, but nobody's building them. I mean, I guess my vote would be yes as of today on the rezoning portion of it.
Thank you, Mr. Frederick.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Kovacs.
I would tend to agree with Mr. Frederick. I think if we didn't want this project, I think we should have done that long ago. I think they spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and to sit here and tell them we don't want it, I don't think that's right. So I probably would be one for voting yes on this as well.
Thank you, Ms. Kovacs. Ms. Pierce.
Mr. Chairman, I also would tend to agree with Mr. Kovacs and Mr. Friedrich. I don't think that you can hold land hostage just because other people are not developing. Landowners have the right to improve their property. If this were much further out and we were talking about miles of city infrastructure trying to go out to a piece of land, I might feel differently. I think this is close enough in that it's not unreasonable thinking about the infrastructure to get there. I do think it is, I am questioning the developer's eagerness to build this just because of the current climate. I feel like it's possible they're going to lose their shirts over it, and I guess that's their choice, you know, that in our free market. I do think if they're this eager and they are going to build it, that would be a good thing for this community. Looking at the uses, looking at the plan for what would go there, like the chairman said, I don't see any problem with the plan for what would go there. I do think, though, I was leaning towards just approving phase one, only because I don't want a tax on the city, you know, budget as far as paying for infrastructure and so forth. But if we can work all that out in a developer agreement, and the feeling is that it would be difficult to develop it without having both phases approved, then I might lean towards approving the entire piece.
Thank you, Ms. Perry. Any other comments? This time we'll close the public portion of this hearing and ask for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, can I go ahead and give the staff recommendation,
I'm sorry, Mr.
please?
Josephson.
Okay.
I want to hear a recommendation.
Okay.
Mr. Josephson.
All right, the recommendation from staff is we looked at this, it's Steve Josephson, City County Planner. We looked at this in terms of which portions of the proposed rezoning have infrastructure that's assured to it, and which portions of it currently appear not to. And I know the applicant had come in and asked for rezoning all 280 acres. Currently, there's assurances of water and sewer and access to the eastern portion, the portion that they showed as phase one. The right-of-way issue still needs to be worked out for phase two. In a sense, think of this as whether or not you would approve a similar residential development where there's no platted street in front of it. And, you know, from a staff perspective, it's just premature for that portion of it. We have a policy in our comprehensive plan that states that residential development must have two access points unless they get other approval from the fire department, and they haven't approved for that portion of it. And I know they have talked about we're going to plat this and we're going to have a development agreement and so on, but without that assurance of right-of-way, without having the right-of-way to construct a collector road at this time, especially for residential development that's, given emergencies that could happen, is premature. You know, there's also been the talk about providing sewer services, and we appreciate that that during a negotiation, during a development agreement, the developer has offered verbally to pay for providing the sewer for the lift service, the gravity main, and so on. That's still a verbal promise. I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't do it, but it's still a verbal promise. Having looked at the eastern portion of it, infrastructure is either being built or is in place to provide water and sewer services. Fairway Street is a platted street, So there's access to that. So based upon that, the staff recommendation was to approve the rezoning on the portion that they show as Phase 1 and to deny it. And it's not saying that in terms of compatibility of land or even the issue of R1 zoning that it would be inappropriate, because certainly we do. It's just at this point, it's difficult to provide, to provide the infrastructure that's needed to support a residential development. The other consideration too is that Phase 1 is primarily commercial development, which is compatible with the development to the east of it in Dickinson Hills. So based upon that, that was the staff recommendation to recommend approval of the rezoning on the eastern portion on that Phase 1, and then denial for Phase 2 until sometime in the future when they can show that they would have the infrastructure to access what's going to be primarily a residential neighborhood. So, commissioners, you have before you three ways that you can go on this. The first one, which is the staff recommendation, is the approval of Phase 1 only. The second action that you can take today is a recommendation of approval for the entire rezoning on all 284 acres. And the third one is a denial of the entire rezoning. And I've given my recommendation. It's going to be up to you to look at the larger issues and make your decision. And I'm here to answer any questions about the staff recommendation.
I only have one question. We keep talking about access. So we're saying the 66 feet is not going to be enough. I mean, the way I understood, we needed the 100-foot right-of-way is if we were ever going to put an overpass over the interstate there. I mean, if that never happens, is there going to be too much traffic for a normal street there that we need the 100-foot? And they're willing to give us the 100-foot on their portion, so who can answer that one?
Mr. Kubas?
Commissioner Frederick, you're correct. The street was laid out in our comprehensive plan as a future collector, with the thought that, and I think there's been enough discussion where everyone's fairly comfortable that maybe 10 or 20 years down the road, that's an overpass, and that will be our major connection to the north and south between exit 59 and exit 56, further to the west. Right now, I don't know. We haven't, of course, seen a traffic impact study for Barron's Vista. So to know exactly how much traffic would be using 50th, assuming it's just traffic south of the interstate, we don't really have those numbers yet. I do know that, a 40-foot street, if built on the 50th Avenue right-of-way that exists today, the 66 feet of easement, would handle some amount of traffic. Most of our streets in Dickinson are 40-foot streets. Ultimately, when it develops, the 100-foot comes into play. I think the condition that was requested last time was to obtain the 100 feet of right-of-way. Mr. Circle mentioned that there was a meeting with the property owner to the south, one of the property owners to the south, and at this time they're not willing to donate to sell additional right-of-way. So I don't have an exact answer of saying 50th as a 40-foot street could handle this entire development. We haven't really gotten that far to show us the traffic numbers of what's going to be generated here.
Thank you, Mr. Kubas.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more
Ms.
question.
Pierce?
As far as staff's concern about Phase 1 and Phase 2 and improving the zoning, in your estimation, if it's legally possible in the developer agreement to put some kind of breaker in there as far as, having to develop Phase 1 first and then Phase 2, would that kind of assuage your concern about giving the zoning for Phase 1 first, or is there, as far as staff recommendation? I'm really having trouble with the Phase 1 versus approving the entire thing, and if there's some way that the developer agreement could be written that would do the same thing as not giving zoning approval for the Phase 2 right now.
Commissioner Pierce, what I would say to that is we've spent a fair amount of time and effort doing a West Dickinson plan. And part of the issues in the West Dickinson plan was not just identifying what could possibly come in that area, but also assuring that future development is going to have the infrastructure in place in order to serve it. And that's one thing I've looked for guidance. And yes, there's one more meeting to go before it's approved by City Commission. But at this point, there's been so much invested. There's been so much invested in this, and we've had support today. You know, today Planning and Zoning Commission recommended approval of it. It's already had initial approval at a first hearing from the City Planning Commission, and will more than likely get approved at the first meeting in March. So my concern is going forward with a rezoning for the entire property where a portion of this is not going to be in compliance with the West Dickinson plan, which is to ensure that they're either to see that there's infrastructure available or that it's assured in order to service development. And again, that's why I said the eastern portion of it, there are assurances that there's going to be infrastructure in order to serve the development, but the western portion, not so much. And at this point, my understanding with the standard rezoning is we can't condition it. You know, so we can't condition it to say, well, the city and the developers are going to enter into a development agreement, or make it contingent upon a development agreement or anything of that sort. It's just straight up and down.
Okay.
They've either got the entitlement or they don't.
Okay, that was what I was getting at. So we don't have a mechanism right now that says that it can be contingent on a development agreement, that the plan basically, the infrastructure has to be there first before we could rezone according to the plan. Is that
And
correct?
that's my interpretation. That's my interpretation of it. The rezoning is giving it an entitlement, which then allows somebody to go on and it permits them to enter into the system, the whole development system, which is the preliminary plat, the final plat, you know, everything from there on in. So staff's perspective is why at this point do we want to give an entitlement to a piece of property where there are still some issues in terms of service from infrastructure, especially a proposed residential, a very large residential development where second access point is not assured.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Josephson.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Jackson.
you know, this is what I was referring to earlier. If we approve this, that means we're embracing this project. That means we're saying the community needs this project. So if we need it as a city, we have to get involved with the acquisition of that right away, in my opinion. We can't ask the developer to do something that he's not able to do. It's not within his power to do it. It is within the city's power. And if we approve this, I think we have to get involved with that.
Any other comments? And from my perspective, like I said, reiterate, as far as just a straight rezone with no implications, that's fine, but there are too many things that have been hanging out there that we haven't been able to clean up as far as infrastructure and access to this property. And we don't know if the city really wants to get involved in what ultimately, it's talking about money, cost sharing, a lot of cost sharing. We just had a project on the north side not so long ago that I think we forgave, I don't know, or we picked up a pretty good chunk of change on a road that was supposed to be put in. And we've got other ones hanging out there that should have been put in and still not done. I would like to see things cleaned up prior to any phase 1, phase 2, the whole project. I'd like to see someone put some money on the table and some really secure contracts and agreements, legally binding, that would force all parties concerned to do what they say they would like to do, even though You know, we can all draw nice drawings and present them and say this would be a great project. Well, someone's got to pay for it, and I don't think the city's ready to pay for it yet, even though it's a nice looking project. Mr. Coley.
Mr. President, just to clarify, I guess, from staff's perspective, I think we've always taken the rezoning decision by this commission to be the initial indication as to whether or not we should, as staff, enter into negotiations with the developer with respect to a development agreement. If I understand your comments correctly, you would like staff to do that negotiation of a development agreement prior to a rezoning?
I would like to see that, but I would like to see the developers and the other private parties concerned bring something to you that you don't have to muddle through then and do it for them. Things that they should be out doing themselves and not putting a huge burden on your time and your staff to do things that they should go out and get. You know, if I want to go through my neighbor's field, I have to go get that agreement with him up at the farm and do whatever. They're private agreements that have to be established. And something like that, I think, should be done prior to them coming to take up your time. In this particular one, if they want to come say, here's whatever it takes, we're going to pay for Fairway going through the Dickinson West that hasn't been built. We're going to pay for that road and we're going to build it. And here's the agreement, we'll hire the contractor, we're going to start building tomorrow. We need that access. We're going to go out to the west end and we're going to do whatever we have to do to get 100 feet or whatever it is to go down that section line. And realistically, I think the contract to go over the interstate is $43 million for that overpass. I don't, isn't it something like that? It's way down the list to go over the overpass.
It is way down the list. I don't know that we have a
But
great
it's
cost estimate.
a huge
$20 million
yeah,
probably.
right, $40 million. That's today. Someone has to pay for that. And those agreements and those legally binding contracts and the money has to be there. And those private parties can come up with that prior to coming to you. And they come to you and say, here, we're gonna do this, and we'll do this if we get this rezoning. Of course, you got it then. But you know, to rezone and then give an implication of any type of privileges or something in the future, at this point in time, I find it a problem with this particular one because it's happened before, and we have so much property, we have so much commitment to infrastructure out there. And we're debating: are we going to stretch ourselves all the way out to the new exchange? What's the city going to do with there, and how much cost are we going to have before we recoup that, before it becomes a real benefit to do that?
I think as staff, I don't think we're ever going to be in a position to negotiate those agreements until we know from this commission what the zoning, what your preferred zoning is for that area. I think we'd be negotiating in the dark otherwise. It would be my preference that you make a decision on zoning on what the best use of this property is, and then staff can take that as direction to work with the developer to make that happen. Otherwise, I think it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem. We've got to have an indication from the commission as to what you are willing to see this property developed as, and then we have a method to go and negotiate with the developer. Otherwise, I think we're negotiating in the dark.
Commissioner Abramson, from what I got from what you were saying, you would prefer if somebody, especially for a project of this size, came forward for a rezoning and said, we've worked it out, we've talked to whoever it is, and we've worked. It's not necessarily the city getting involved with it, but somebody walking forward and saying, we've got a commitment that we can provide this, and we can provide, we can provide whatever is needed in order to service it. That's what I heard from your comment.
I think that's it, and probably they had a check in hand would be even better. A real commitment, that's what I'd like to see.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Frederick.
I'm ready to make a motion if we're ready. I think it's time to bring it to a vote. We've had plenty of
Any
discussion.
further discussion? At this time, we'll close public portion of this hearing then, and Mr. Frederick would like to make a motion.
I move the City of Dickinson Planning and Zoning Commission to recommend approval of the Barron's Vista rezone from agriculture to R1, R2, CC, GC, and P as being consistent with the City of Dickinson Comprehensive Plan and as meeting all the requirements of the Dickinson Municipal Code and also being in the interest of public health, safety, and welfare. I also would like to add a condition that before a plat is brought forth, as part of my motion, that a development agreement is worked out between the parties in the city.
Thank you, Mr. Friedrich. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Ballesteros. Any further discussion?
I would just ask the Attorney Colling, in terms of Mr. Friedrich's condition, this is a standard rezoning. Is that, I just wanted to check and make certain that that's something that they can make as part of their recommendation.
I'm comfortable with the motion.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Coley. Any other discussion? Being none. Mr. Pierce.
I would just like to get a feel from the commission because I am comfortable approving phase one. That's sort of where I stand, and I didn't know if anyone else on the board there, because I would vote no on that motion, and I would make a new motion for phase one. I would like to get a feeling from the commissioners, because if no one is going to vote for phase one, then I would vote yes on this motion, if that makes sense.
Mr. Friedrich, we still have time. Would you like to withdraw that first motion?
I'm sorry.
I'm asking Mr. Friedrich, would you like to withdraw that?
If I make the first one first, and then we do yours.
Sure. That's fine with me.
Okay, Mr. Ballesteros, that's fine with you? All right.
All right, then I would, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the City of Dickinson Planning and Zoning Commission recommend approval of phase one of the Barron's Vista rezoning from agriculture to R1, R2, CC, GC, and P as depicted in the attachment A as being consistent with the City of Dickinson Comprehensive Plan and is meeting all the requirements of the Dickinson Municipal Code, and also being in the interest of the public health, safety, and welfare, and move for denial of phase two of Barron's Vista rezone as not being consistent with the City of Dickinson Comprehensive Plan and is not meeting all the requirements of the Dickinson Municipal Code and being contrary to interests of the public health, safety, and welfare, and would add that the developer would need to work out a development agreement along with that rezone.
Ms. Pierce, would you like to put a timeline on that development agreement?
Yeah, I think the 2-year, if we can do that, have a sunset within 2 years if nothing has happened with the agreement.
Well, thank you for that addition. Is there a second to that motion? Ask for a second to the motion. Being none, motion failed. Failure for a second. Mr. Friedrich.
Can I introduce my motion? Or do
Yes,
I have
you.
to read it again?
Yes, you may.
Read it again?
Your motion was for recommending the whole project.
Correct.
And I would ask if you'd like to put a sunset clause on that?
I think the only stipulation I'd have in my motion is that before they came back for preliminary plat, we'd have a development agreement in place.
Okay, that's fine.
Previously stated.
Fine. Is there a second to that? Second by Mr. Ballesteros. Any further discussion? No. Being none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
No.
So at this point in time, we'll walk away with no recommendation. It was a tie vote.
Mr. President,
Yes.
can I make a recommendation that you take a roll call vote on
Sure.
this motion?
Okay. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying yes. Those opposed will say no. Mr. Jackson?
No.
Mr. Elkin?
No.
Ms. O'Brien?
No.
Mr. Friedrich?
Yes.
Mr. Kovash? Mr. Ballesteros?
Yes.
Ms. Pierce? And the chair votes no. So it is a tie, and so it goes with no recommendation. If you'd like, we can pass this recommendation along to the city. It will go to the city council. You can appeal this, and you can present your case to the city if you'd like. Thank you very much. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to bring before the commission this morning? If being none, I'd ask for a motion to adjourn. Second? Second. Meeting adjourned. Well, that was good.